and under his leadership is starting to do some really wonderful things. He's also, been thoughtful enough to sponsor this evening's reception, which will be in the center itself, and happens to highlight a very cool art exhibit that was kind of, in many ways, I think, the brainchild of Dr. McKee a little bit as well, showing, horse cultures here in North America. So the event here today has a lot to do with Dr. Andrew's support, but he's here to share with you some of his own scholarship on now shifting away from our kind of Eurasia and Africa lens to talking more and moving into the 19th century, talking about human-animal interactions and the great horse flu epizootic, in which he's just recently prepared a very, very cool book that will be hitting bookshelves one of these days before too terribly long. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Thomas Andrews for our next lecture.
All right. Okay, that's working, right?
Keep it close if you can.
Yeah, real close.
Yeah.
It's like my shirt. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, I really appreciate the invitation to join in this and to celebrate your accomplishment with this wonderful book. I'm going to just start off asking for a little bit of forgiveness. I'm a little discombobulated today, so I'm sleep deprived among other things. What I wanted to talk to you about is mostly a pretty small section of the book that I've been working on. And what so what I'm going to get to then is talking about the ways in which a huge outbreak of equine influenza in 1872 and 1873, the sorts of responses that it prompts from humans, and in particular the ways in which this what I'm calling the Great Horse Flu prompted a real upswing in activity by humane organizations. But that activity had kind of a mixed set of outcomes. And so that's what I'm going to proceed to explore in the body of the talk. But first I want to give you some context so that you understand the outbreak that I'm talking about. Because it's really quite extraordinary, and that's what kind of drew me to pursue this project, was the scale and the scope and the profound impacts that this disease outbreak would have. So let me see if I can get this to play. Yeah, okay. So this is now playing, and so this is a heat map based on close to 2,000 newspaper accounts. And what this is recording, or trying to sort of, portray, is the dates of initial appearance of this flu outbreak. And, the mapping is a little bit, there's some problems here. There are areas of poor news coverage. There are places where, for reasons that are kind of tough to piece back together, this event wasn't covered very well, even though I can figure out that it was present. So the basic story here then is that starting in late September of 1872, horses in the countryside north of Toronto, Ontario, started falling ill. And the sort of first cases are actually quite well pinpointed in the contemporary literature. So even though Toronto was, by this point it was the largest city in Ontario, it was becoming relatively important, still had less than 100,000 people. If you're familiar with Greater Toronto, this would, the first cases started showing up in the townships of Scarborough, Markham, York. These are like heavily suburban areas today. But at the time that the outbreak first appeared, this was essentially a kind of market farming hinterland. And what's interesting to me about the location of the initial reports of influenza among horses then is that this is inland, and it's not in the city. It's about 12, 15 miles north of the city. It's not on the lake. And so my supposition, and the sort of interpretation of this outbreak that I developed in the book then, is that this was a newly evolved mutation of influenza. So to give you a little bit of quick background on equine influenza, it had occurred previously in the Americas. It was quite common. Veterinary surgeons in the United States, in Canada, in Latin America were familiar with it. They diagnosed it, and so this isn't a virgin soil epidemic. And given the location of where it first appears, as well as the lack of reports elsewhere in the world of large-scale flu outbreaks at the same time, it seems like this is a homegrown, mutation essentially that develops in the countryside outside of Toronto. And what ends up being really significant about this new variant of flu is its tremendous infectiousness. So in any given area, once this disease, once the first cases show up, within about a week to 10 days, in most places, even as many as 90% of horses would fall ill. Within 2 to 3 weeks, the outbreak would reach infection rates of 95%, even 99%. So this is in a lot of ways, it might actually be the most infectious disease outbreak of any sort in recorded history. And it hits everywhere. So it starts spreading outside. The first leap that it takes is from the countryside to Toronto. And then from Toronto, it just starts spreading outwards, really in sort of every direction where there are horses. As far as how it spreads, it's clear that railroads probably played some role. In some places, it seems like steamships of various sorts were important. But I don't think that this is really primarily spread by horses being transported. I think that, in fact, what you have is essentially an unbroken chain of horse populations throughout the northern Americas, and it's essentially just horse-to-horse transmission rather than like long-distance transportation of sick horses playing all that significant a role. And I think the heat map kind of supports that interpretation. I'll play it again just so you can kind of see it again with this better context. And in terms of the areas that this ends up reaching, it hits every area of North America that has horses, with the exception of Key West and Prince Edward Island. And then it also gets down into Cuba. It gets pretty far into Mexico. And the furthest south reports of cases are down in Nicaragua. There's a report of it out in the Sandwich Islands, soon become known as Hawaii. And in all these areas then, what ends up happening then is huge variety of societies, right? We've got, Canada, urban areas, rural areas. We've got various parts of the United States, plantation zones, indigenous homelands. It's hitting all of these places. And these are all equine-dependent societies to some degree or other. And so wherever this hits, it's kind of, it's just sort of chaos erupts, because you have this huge upswing in morbidity. The other thing that is important for understanding why this has such a big impact is that almost immediately, and this is, in a lot of ways, this is building upon ideas about flu care that had already emerged, and these ideas about flu care are really, there's a lot of traffic between physicians and veterinary surgeons during this time period. So they're mostly, the sort of standard advice is treat your horse as you would treat your family. And what that means by the early 1870s is take a minimal approach. There's a real turn away from the sort of heroic, the purgatives and blistering and all these sorts of dramatic and often counterproductive interventions that have been common for decades and in a lot of ways even for centuries when it comes to equine veterinary care. The idea is, if your horse gets sick, let it rest, take it off the job, coddle it. There's all sorts of ideas about warmth and how to feed the horses. What ends up being significant about this then is that it creates kind of a double whammy of disruption, because not only is the disease itself tremendously disruptive, but then people believe that the best way to treat it is to keep their horses off or their mules or their donkeys off the job for a longer period of time. And so, you know, this ends up just sort of, you know, whether you're in the countryside or the city, whether you're in the north or the south, in Canada or in Cuba, this is paralyzing. And that sort of economic and commercial paralysis, that disruption of sort of everyday patterns of, you know, whether it's commuting to work in the city or going to church on Sunday, all of the things that people used horses to do, they can't do them in the same way. And so, you know, in any given place, there's like a 2 to 4 week period. And so this is like a really, you know, it's like a snow day that lasts for weeks, that's just sort of slowly moving across the entire continent. And, you know, as I said, it starts in late September, hits its peak in the urban Northeast in basically November, October and November. It doesn't get to the West Coast until March, April, May. And so it's like a 9-month event. And you know, there's a tremendous amount of news coverage on it. So that's what my work mostly draws on. So that's kind of the general picture then with the outbreak. And what I want to turn to then is the ways that humanitarian reformers would react to it. And to frame this, so you know, that's kind of the giant picture. Now I'm going to get really granular, and I want to start out with a single document. And I'm going to switch to reading a little bit here, so I hope you all won't mind. So a few months after the epizootic is the term that was frequently used at the time, right? It's the animal counterpart to an epidemic. So a few months after the epizootic peaked, the Brooklyn Union published a strange little article. Entitled The Horse's Letter, it offered an arresting exploration of suffering and sympathy, dependence and resistance. Thomas DeWitt Talmage, an immensely popular Presbyterian minister, whose 5,000-seat Brooklyn Tabernacle, it's like a 19th century megachurch, had burned to the ground just a few months earlier, credited himself as translator for this missive, which was signed Charlie Bucephalus and addressed from the Brooklyn Livery Stables. And so here's what Talmage wrote. In his nom de plume, he's assuming the identity of this horse, Charlie Bucephalus. He said, "I am aware that this is the first time a horse has ever taken it upon himself to address any member of the human family." And indeed, this document, A Horse's Letter, predated and anticipated 19th century literature's two most famous examples of equine ventriloquism. Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, which was written starting in 1871 but wasn't published until 1877, and Leo Tolstoy's Holstemer, or The Strider, which Tolstoy began in the 1860s, we think, but which didn't reach print until 1886. Charlie, who claimed to be a direct paternal descendant from Alexander the Great's beloved steed Bucephalus, who legend held was born in the same hour as his conquering master, declared that although he and his fellow equines had, quote, endured in silence all the outrages of many thousands of years, they had collectively decided that it was now time to make remonstrance. The recent attentions, Charlie said, that horses had enjoyed during the epizootic's peak have made us more aware of our worth. So throughout the height of the epizootic, Charlie recounted, and I'm gonna stop saying quote unquote. A lot of what I'm saying is quotations here. It's just gonna get kind of awkward. So if it sounds like 19th century writing, it probably is. We had at our stables innumerable calls from doctors and judges and clergymen. Everyone asked us about our health. Groomsmen bathed our throats and sat up with us at nights and furnished us pocket handkerchiefs. For the first time in years, we had quiet Sundays. At the height of the crisis, Charlie and his stablemates overheard a conversation that made us think that commerce and the fashion of the world waited the news from the stable. Telegraphs announced our conditions across the land and under the sea, and we came, Charlie reminisced, to believe that the world was originally made for the horse and man his groom. So, you know, this is a clergyman writing, looking backwards essentially at the height of the outbreak, assuming the identity of this horse, and talking about this kind of, you know, remarkable upswing in human concern for horses. And you know, to kind of set this in the context of the outbreak in the urban Northeast, the Great Horse Flu really laid bare just how addicted America was to the power that horses placed at human disposal. Wherever and whenever the novel influenza virus struck, appreciation for equines surged. Suddenly, every horse owner who has been accustomed to abuse his animal, now that there is a prospect of losing him, declared the Chicago Tribune, discovers that he is a dear friend, a noble creature, deserving of the kindest consideration and most touching care. So these are the sorts of broader public sentiments that would motivate anti-cruelty organizations to try to take action. And the key figure then in this set of debates around horses and suffering and care in New York City would be a quite well-known figure named Henry Bergh. And Bergh was the founder of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty toward Animals, the ASPCA. And Bergh had founded this organization 7 years before the outbreak, actually 6 years before the outbreak. He was the secretary to the American legation to the Russian court, and he was horrified by the way Russians treated horses. That was actually what really inspired him to take action. On his way back to the United States, he stopped in the UK, took the pulse of what the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty toward Animals was doing, and modeled the ASPCA after the RSPCA. And so specifically what that meant then was that Bergh pressured the New York State legislature to adopt anti-cruelty legislation, and then he also had the legislature empower his organization to exercise the police powers of the state to enforce these new rules. And so that's kind of the combination then that Bergh sets that in motion, but there's sort of broader concerns, and other humane reformers would follow a similar path. So really hinging on state legislation on the one hand, and then humane organizations as the enforcement wing for these new state laws. And so these are the tools that activists have to address the mounting popular discontent among the public. The public was especially concerned, and you see this in sort of journalism at the time describes a tremendous amount of concern. And so, for instance, we see a New York Street Railway official claiming that the public was rich of pity for the horses. A journalist similarly noted that public feeling throughout the city had grown strongly derisive of the inhumanity of forcing sick steeds to work. And so what Bergh then and his allies proceed to do is they target two main opponents. These are the two groups that they blame for overworking horses, for failing to rest them, for failing to do like what by this point people think is the obvious solution, or at least the obvious treatment for this malady, which is essentially take the horses off the streets, put them in the stables. And so the two main targets would be street railway corporations and common horse workers. And so these two sets of conflicts then play out in quite different ways. When it comes to the street railway corporations, we're talking about some of the really, really powerful entities in any city. So in New York, we're talking about like the Vanderbilts were operating street railways during this time period. A lot of the biggest kind of heavy hitters in the the continent's richest and most powerful metropolis. They were taking the lead on this. And so Bergh tries to use basically public shaming of these corporations. He's very adept at getting news coverage. He was, Bergh is like a towering figure, very like elaborate mustache and a cape, and he would sort of stride around the city. And so he was the kind of figure that like reporters love to tail. And so there's a lot of news coverage then of Bergh's efforts to police this by writing tickets and that sort of thing, hauling street railway conductors into court. They also followed Bergh as he would implore railway executives to basically cut some slack to their horses and take them off the job. Over time though, so over the course of several days, there's this interesting dynamic where initially Bergh is relatively successful. Most of the street railways do withdraw their horses. That means that essentially the city's at a standstill. There's no mass transit of any sort. People can't move around the city at all. It's kind of a total transportation meltdown. But pretty quickly, the corporations, as you'd sort of expect, begin to put profit back as their top priority. And so even before the horses are ready to go back to work, the street railway corporations start putting them back on the job. By this point, there's sort of a switch in public sentiment, which I think is largely a reaction to the amount of disruption that the suspension of rail service had caused. And so, the public starts sort of turning against Berg and starts turning against the enforcement of these anti-cruelty statutes. And then the other big dynamic then would really center on common horse workers. And by that I mean people like cabbies, carters, draymen. There's the whole, right, we're talking about a time period in the this is the early 1870s, and so steam is having tremendous impacts, of course, on long distance transportation. That's kind of tracking backwards into medium distance transportation a bit, but with short distance travel of pretty much any sort, it's all horsepower during this time period. And this is before like most big cities had union railway stations, so a lot of times there's, goods need to be transshipped even between railway points or from railways to steamships. And so horses are essential to everything. You have thousands and thousands of workers whose existence depends on, one or two horses, one or two mules, and a cart or a wagon or some other sort of conveyance. And here we really see the kind of classist dimensions of humane reform during the time period. Berg was a wealthy, he was a scion of a shipbuilding family. That's part of why the newspapers like to cover him. He was like a, kind of a mucky-muck. But when the ASPCA folks start cracking down on, common horse workers, dragging them into court, that's much less popular among the public. And so, we see this sort of like, the bottom line then is that this, even though the outbreak would generate this increased concern for horses and this feeling that, there's this sort of feeling that this is a wake-up call, that forms of mistreatment and neglect and abuse that had been, that this exposed a situation that was just not okay. That moment or that sort of window for people to undertake any sort of meaningful change closes pretty quickly, closes within a week or two. And that leads us back then to Charlie Bucephalus and the letter. And so this is what I'm going to finish with is kind of the rest of the letter. So Charlie realizes that the state of grace that equines had enjoyed during the outbreak's height, that this was too good to last. Things, Charlie grumbled, are going back again where they were. He rattles off a litany of wrongs. He complains that he was driven too far, that he was fed too little, that he was jerked in the mouth, struck on the back, and left unblanketed in the cold. And then his companions at the Brooklyn Livery Stable, according to Charlie, were also suffering from a resurgence of maltreatment and neglect. Many of them, in fact, had suffered from abuses and indignities in the outbreak's aftermath that were even more diabolical than the ones Charlie had. And so then Charlie describes this kind of startling scene. He says that, the other night after our owner had gone home and the hostlers were asleep, we held an indignation meeting. When it came Charlie's turn to address this equine assembly, he told his life story. He recalled echoing a key trope in abolitionist literature, the day his whole family was sold. He also talked about his aunt's death from the epizootic and the physical and emotional pain he had suffered throughout his life from the saddles that gall, the spurs that prick, the snaffles that pinch, the loads that kill. Charlie's impassioned recitation of woes pushed one vicious-looking nag past her breaking point, rearing up and taking the floor in a scene that was almost certainly inspired by the highly negative caricatures of female communards that peppered much of the American media's coverage on the Paris Commune of 1871. This mare, and this is a long quote, squealed out the suggestion that it was time for a rebellion, and she moved that we take the field, and that all those who could kick should kick, and that all those who could bite should bite, and that all those who could bolt should bolt, and that all those who could run away should run away, and that thus we fill the land with broken wagons and smashed heads, and teach our oppressors that the day of retribution has come, and that our downtrodden race will no more be trifled with. And then the sort of forces in the room, they put the nags' call to unite and declare their independence from humankind to a vote. And here we get to some kind of cheesy humor. Not one said I, Charlie loyally reported. You can hear what's coming, right? But all cried, nay, nay. And for the space of half an hour kept on neighing. After shouting out the harsh measure of revolution, the assembled equines opted to give Brooklynites another chance. Favoring persuasion and patience over rebellion and revenge, they voted, Charlie explained, that I should write this letter of remonstrance. Charlie concluded this letter by urging his readers to remember that we, like yourselves, have moods and cannot always be frisky and cheerful. Talmage's narrator employed humans to treat horses more generously. Care for us at some other time than during the epizootics, he pled, so that we may see your kindness is not selfish. My dear friends, Charlie entreated, our interests are mutual. I am a silent partner in your business. Under my sound hoof is the diamond of national prosperity, and beyond my nostril, the world's progress may not go. Be kind to me, he begged, if you want me to be useful to you. And so with that then, Charlie really, sort of called American society to task and, offered this really interesting meditation then on the vulnerability that equine dependence had caused for humankind in, what we often think of as the steam age. So I haven't left as much time as I should have for questions, but I have time to answer a couple. One thing I should have said at the outbreak that people are probably wondering is what the mortality rates were. It's about 1% to 4% probably. And what we're talking about then is that, my estimates then for total fatalities would be in the, at least 100,000 horses, maybe as many as 500,000. And that, even at the lower rate, that's basically a rate of equine death that outpaced the tremendous amount of killing that horses and mules would suffer during the American Civil War. So yeah, any questions?
Well, let's give a round. Okay, so we do have time for a few questions here.
Was there initially any concern about transmission to humans, and how did that impact the whole period?
Yeah, great question. So there's concern about transmission to a number of species, and there's quite a lot of evidence. It seems pretty clear that this does spread to poultry and to hogs, and and among those creatures, there does seem to be community spread. With humans, there's a fair amount of spillover. It seems pretty patchy, and so there's no real reason to there's no real evidence that this generates a real human epidemic. But in quite a few communities, there are hundreds of cases, and some of the more vulnerable populations in the U.S. So African Americans in a few places in the South, and then also Yavapai and Ende or Apache people in Arizona would actually suffer relatively high fatalities from this if we're to believe the contemporary newspaper accounts. Toward that point too, there's also actually some really interesting scientific research that's basically genomic evidence of recent and ancient influenza samples from a variety of species that suggests that there's a big event in the internal genes of influenza viruses, and this is the most likely outbreak for that, and that's across species: humans, horses, hogs, poultry, fruit bats. So it does seem to be a relatively major disease event in the sort of bigger history of influenza as well.
Time for one more question here.
So I know that you noted that sympathy waned as the economy and business kind of grumbled to a halt during the flu, despite the initial sympathies. Was it ultimately more of the same sort of narrative that we heard in the letter that ultimately pushed towards the society and understanding that we have today, or was it the technological introductions that more allowed for that to become prevalent, as you mentioned, the class aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so during the outbreak, there's this growing concern for horses, right? And One response to that is, humane policing. Another response to that is to put more energy into mechanization, especially mechanization of street transport. But the mechanization doesn't make progress because of this, and in fact, most street transit, you don't start getting like electrified streetcars making any real impact until the mid-1880s. And so I think in most respects in the story is that humans remain heavily dependent on horses in urban areas and rural areas alike, really into the 1910s. And you see, I wouldn't say that you see good evidence that equine lives improve at all over those decades. Does that answer your question? Okay.
One more round of applause here for Dr. We're just going to take a quick